Pack your desk. You're done here. Vivian Whitmore didn't even look up when she said it, her pen still moving across a page as though the man standing across the table were nothing more than a line item to be closed out. Darius Bell, a quiet man who had spent nearly 3 years keeping the company's operations from falling apart, said nothing at first. The executives lining the walls of the room exchanged glances, some smug, some simply relieved it wasn't them. Darius reached for his old leather bag, the one with the frayed strap he had never bothered to replace, and rose from his chair without a sound. He walked toward the door the way a man walks out of a house he no longer recognizes. Slow, deliberate, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him rush. Behind him, the elevator chimed. The doors slid open. A man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit stepped into the hallway, and the moment his eyes landed on Darius, something in the room changed before a single word was spoken. The man froze mid-step. Darius froze too. For a long moment, neither of them moved, as if the hallway itself had folded time around them, and then the stranger crossed the distance in 3 strides and pulled Darius into an embrace so full of relief that several people watching forgot to breathe. "Brother," the man said, his voice cracking just slightly, "you actually made it." Vivian stood in the doorway of the conference room, papers still in hand, watching a scene she did not understand and instantly did not like. She had never seen this man before in her life, yet he was holding her fired employee like a long-lost family member, and something cold settled low in her stomach. The stranger finally released Darius, stepped back, and turned toward Vivian with an expression that was polite, composed, and utterly unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. The conference room had gone cold long before Vivian ever opened her mouth. The kind of silence that settles over a place when everyone in it already knows something painful is about to happen, and no one is willing to stop it. Darius stood at the far end of the table, his hands folded in front of him, his posture calm in a way that unsettled the people around him more than anger ever could have. Vivian set a folder down with a soft, deliberate thud, the sound somehow louder than it should have been in a room built for silence. She didn't offer him a chair. She didn't offer him coffee. She simply said the words that would end 3 years of quiet, unglamorous work in less time than it took to pour a cup of coffee down the hall. Darius absorbed the sentence the way a man absorbs weather, without flinching, without giving it more power than it already had. "May I know why?" he asked, his voice even, almost gentle, the kind of question a man asks when he already suspects the answer will not satisfy him. Vivian told him the company was moving in a new direction, that his role no longer aligned with where Whitmore Industries needed to go, phrases she had likely rehearsed in front of a mirror or borrowed from a consultant's slide deck. Before Darius could respond, Grant Holloway, the chief financial officer seated 2 chairs down, leaned back with the satisfied posture of a man who had been waiting years for this exact moment. "People like him are useful," Grant said, glancing around the table for approval, "until the company grows past needing them." A few executives chuckled under their breath, the kind of laughter that exists only to protect the person laughing from having to feel anything. Darius did not look at Grant. He kept his eyes on Vivian, steady, patient, refusing to let the insult land the way Grant clearly intended it to. "Is that your decision?" he asked her directly, cutting past everyone else in the room as though they were furniture. Vivian met his gaze and said, simply, "It is." Darius nodded once, the kind of nod that carries more weight than an argument ever could, and said, "Then I'll respect it." There was no anger in his voice, no plea, no attempt to negotiate for a severance package or a second chance, and the absence of those things seemed to unsettle Vivian more than if he had shouted. He reached for his bag, the leather worn soft at the corners from years of use, and began collecting the handful of items that had made his desk feel like his own. A chipped mug, a small notebook, a photograph turned face down that no one in the room bothered to notice. A few employees had gathered near the glass wall outside the conference room, drawn by the particular gravity that surrounds a firing in a company where everyone secretly wonders if they might be next. Some of their faces held pity, the soft, useless kind that changes nothing. Others wore expressions closer to amusement, the quiet cruelty of people relieved that the axe had landed somewhere other than their own necks. Darius walked past all of them, without meeting a single eye. Not out of arrogance, but because he had long ago learned that dignity required no audience to be real. He reached the hallway, just as the elevator doors parted, and the man who stepped out stopped him cold, close enough to shake his hand, but instead pulling him into an embrace that spoke of years neither of them had spent inside this building. Vivian, watching from the conference room doorway, felt something shift beneath her feet that she could not yet name. The stranger introduced himself with nothing more than a look toward her, then turned his attention fully back to Darius. "I've been looking for you," the man said, and the words carried the weight of someone who had been searching for a long time, not the casual weight of small talk. Vivian stepped forward, folder still clutched against her chest like armor, and asked the only question that made sense to her in that moment. Who exactly was this man? And why did he seem to know the employee she had just discarded better than she ever had? The stranger turned to face her fully for the first time, his expression neither hostile nor warm, simply measured, the look of a man accustomed to being underestimated in rooms exactly like this one. "Why are you carrying your desk out?" he asked Darius, though his eyes remained on Vivian, as if the answer mattered to her more than either of them realized. "I was fired," Darius said plainly. No embellishment, no self-pity, just the fact laid out like a closed file. The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment the calm mask slipped just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. Vivian, sensing the shift in power she could not yet explain, extended her hand and introduced herself as the Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Industries, a title she had worn like a shield for the better part of 2 years. The man looked at her hand, then at her face, and said only, "I know," in a tone that suggested he had known long before he ever stepped off that elevator. What followed was not a conversation Vivian could fully understand from the outside. Two men speaking in the shorthand of people who had survived something together, references to systems, to numbers, to a version of the company that existed long before Vivian ever sat at its head. "Did they ever find out what you built?" the stranger asked Darius quietly, and Darius answered with a simple, "No," the kind of no that closes a door rather than opening one. Vivian caught the exchange and felt the ground tilt slightly further, a sensation she recognized from childhood as the moment right before a secret gets too large to stay buried. Her mind reached backward instinctively, searching for context, for a memory of Darius Bell doing anything remarkable enough to warrant this kind of reunion, and she came up empty, which frightened her more than any answer could have. 3 years earlier, before Vivian had fully settled into her role, Whitmore Industries had nearly collapsed under the weight of a logistics system that failed more often than it functioned, a crisis the company's official history had since quietly smoothed over. Darius, then a contract employee with no title worth mentioning, had spent that period working through nights no one asked him to work, tracing failures back to their source with a patience that bordered on obsession. He never announced his progress in meetings. He never asked for credit when the system stabilized. The recognition, when it finally came, was distributed among people who had done considerably less. Their names attached to reports built on foundations Darius had laid brick by invisible brick. Grant Holloway, sensing the shift in the hallway, and unwilling to let it continue without his interference, stepped forward with the practiced authority of a man who believed rank alone could end any conversation. "This isn't the place for personal reunions," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to remind everyone he was still in the room. The stranger turned toward him slowly, studied him for a beat longer than necessary, and offered a single word in response. "Interesting." That one word did more damage than a full sentence could have, landing in the hallway with the particular weight of a threat dressed as an observation. Grant's confidence flickered, though he tried to mask it by straightening his jacket and glancing toward Vivian for reinforcement she was no longer sure she could offer. The stranger reached into his jacket, retrieved his phone, and typed something brief before sliding it back into his pocket without further explanation. Within seconds, phones across the floor began to buzz in near unison, a ripple of small vibrations moving through pockets and desks like a current beneath still water. Vivian's own phone lit up with a subject line that made her stomach drop before she even opened it. 4 words arranged with a bureaucratic coldness that somehow made them more terrifying. "Ownership transition. Effective immediately." She read it twice, as if a second reading might change the meaning. But the words remained exactly as unforgiving as they had been the first time. The man standing in front of her, the one who had just embraced a fired employee like a brother returning from war, was no longer simply a visitor in her building. He was, as far as the email suggested, its new owner, arriving without ceremony and without the courtesy of advance warning. Vivian looked up from her phone slowly. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning dread, and found him watching her with the patient calm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this reaction. "Now," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, "we can talk about why you fired Darius Bell." The hallway seemed to hold its breath around them, employees pretending to walk past while straining to catch every word, and Vivian understood, perhaps for the first time in her career, that the ground beneath her had shifted permanently. Malcolm Reed did not raise his voice as he led Vivian and Darius back into the conference room, closing the door with a quiet click that felt heavier than any slam could have. Grant trailed behind them, uninvited, unwilling to leave a room where his name might be discussed without his presence to defend it. Vivian sat, though it no longer felt like her chair, her seat at the head of the table suddenly borrowed rather than owned. Darius wasn't performing, she said, trying to reclaim some footing, the words sounding thinner now than they had in the moment she'd fired him. Malcolm studied her for a long moment before sliding a thin folder across the table, the kind of gesture that requires no accompanying speech to feel like an accusation. Vivian opened it slowly, and the numbers inside began rearranging everything she thought she understood about the man she had just discarded. The documents detailed cost reductions that ran into the millions, quiet corrections to a shipping error that could have unraveled 3 major contracts, and a systems failure caught and repaired before a single client noticed anything had gone wrong. Every entry bore the same quiet signature. Work completed without fanfare, without meetings called to announce success, without the self-promotion that had defined nearly every other rising career in that building. "Why didn't I know this?" Vivian asked, and the question came out smaller than she intended, almost like a confession. Darius answered without cruelty, without the satisfaction some men might have taken in finally being seen. "Because nobody asked," he said, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than an accusation ever could have. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Vivian absorb the weight of a mistake that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with attention. "That's the problem with powerful people," Malcolm said, his tone measured, almost gentle despite the force of the words themselves. "They stop looking at the people holding the building up." Vivian felt the sentence settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward into every memory of the past 3 years she had spent walking past Darius's desk without a second glance. She thought of every meeting where his reports had been summarized by someone else, every hallway greeting she had returned with a distracted nod rather than a real acknowledgement. She had judged him, she realized now, not on the substance of his work, but on the surface of him, his plain clothes, his quiet voice, the way he never fought to be noticed in a building built entirely around noise. Grant, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against him, made one final attempt to steady the narrative in his favor. "Those reports could easily be fabricated," Grant said, his voice tight, the confidence of earlier now replaced with something closer to desperation. Darius turned to face him directly for the first time since entering the room, his expression calm but unmistakably certain. "You know they aren't," he said, and something in his tone suggested a history between the two men that ran deeper than office politics. Grant's jaw tensed, a small crack in the composure he had worn like armor for years, and he said nothing further, which told the room more than any denial could have. Vivian watched the exchange with growing unease, sensing that whatever tension existed between Darius and Grant predated her tenure entirely, a conflict she had inherited without ever understanding its origins. "I didn't buy this company because of its profits," Malcolm said finally, breaking the silence that had settled over the table like dust. "Then why?" Vivian asked, genuinely uncertain for the first time in longer than she could remember. Malcolm's eyes drifted toward Darius, and something passed between the two men that no outsider could fully translate, a shared history compressed into a single glance. "Because of what happened 3 years ago," Malcolm said, and the sentence hung in the air with the deliberate weight of a door being unlocked but not yet opened. Darius shifted in his seat, the first visible sign of discomfort he had shown since the meeting began. Malcolm, he said quietly, we agreed you wouldn't tell them. Malcolm met his gaze without apology, his expression steady despite the request. I know, he said, but they just fired the man who saved this company, and I think it's time they understood exactly what that means. The room fell into the kind of silence that precedes a story too large to be told quickly, and Malcolm allowed it to stretch just long enough for everyone present to feel its full weight before he began. 3 years earlier, Whitmore Industries had stood on the edge of collapse, its logistics division bleeding money through failures no one could fully explain, its largest clients preparing quietly to walk away. Darius, then nothing more than a contract worker paid to keep servers running, had noticed something the executives above him had missed entirely, a pattern buried so deep in the company's data that it took him weeks of sleepless nights to fully untangle. It wasn't a technical failure at all. It was deliberate, a slow and careful redirection of value away from the company and into channels that led nowhere anyone wanted to look too closely. He spent those weeks alone, cross-referencing invoices against shipping manifests, comparing approval histories against timestamps that didn't quite align, building a picture no one else in the building had bothered to see. The pattern he found pointed, faintly but unmistakably, toward a name that belonged to someone far above his pay grade, a name that would later become impossible to ignore. He didn't have proof strong enough to accuse anyone outright, not yet, and he understood the danger of speaking too soon in a company where the wrong words could end a career before it had properly begun. Instead of going to management, a decision that, in hindsight, might have buried the truth entirely, Darius reached out to the one outside investor he had met briefly during an earlier project, a quiet man named Malcolm Reed who had asked more questions and demanded less credit than anyone else in the room that day. Darius didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a title or a promise of future reward. He simply told Malcolm the truth as plainly as he understood it, and said the words that would eventually bring both men back to this exact table 3 years later. If you want to save this company, Darius had told him then, don't trust the numbers. Malcolm, intrigued and cautious in equal measure, quietly began his own investigation using the thread Darius had handed him, and what he found confirmed everything the younger man had suspected. But Darius, wary of becoming a target in a company still controlled by the very people he had implicated, asked Malcolm to keep his involvement hidden entirely, a request Malcolm had honored until this very morning. Vivian listened to the story unfold with a growing sense of vertigo, the neat narrative of her own leadership crumbling beneath facts she had never been given the chance to know. So you knew him before I became CEO, she asked Malcolm, her voice quieter now, stripped of the authority it had carried at the start of the meeting. Yes, Malcolm answered simply. And you never told me, Vivian said. Not quite an accusation, closer to a wound spoken aloud. You never asked, Darius replied, echoing the same 3 words that had already reshaped how she saw him once that morning. Malcolm reached into his jacket and produced a second folder, thicker than the first, and placed it on the table with a deliberate care that suggested its contents mattered more than anything discussed so far. There's something else, he said, sliding it toward Vivian rather than Grant, a choice that seemed to register in Grant's expression before anyone opened it. Inside were records spanning 3 years, transactions routed through shell entities with names designed to look forgettable, each one tracing back, eventually, to signatures and approvals that belonged to Grant Holloway. Vivian's hands went still against the pages, the shock of the discovery arriving not as surprise, but as confirmation of something she had perhaps sensed, and never allowed herself to examine too closely. Grant's composure finally cracked, the practiced calm giving way to something raw and more defensive. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising for the first time since the meeting began, the words landing with far less force than he clearly intended. Then explain the numbers, Malcolm said evenly, sliding the folder another inch closer, an invitation Grant had no answer for. Vivian began paging through the documents herself now, cross-referencing dates against memories she hadn't examined in years, and slowly a pattern emerged that made her stomach turn. Darius had warned her, more than once, in language careful enough not to sound like an accusation, about irregularities in the financial reporting that never quite matched operational reality. Each time, Grant had been in the room to smooth the concern away, offering explanations that sounded reasonable in the moment and evaporated the instant she tried to recall them later. Vivian felt something close to shame settle over her as she remembered the specific phrases she had used to dismiss Darius over the years, words that returned now with an ugliness she hadn't recognized at the time. "You're just operations," she had told him once, brushing past his concerns on her way to a meeting she considered more important. "You don't understand executive decisions," she had said another time, the condescension so casual she hadn't even registered it as cruelty. "Know your place," she had told him during a budget review, a phrase she barely remembered saying until this exact moment, when it returned to her like an old bruise pressed too hard. She looked at Darius now, searching his face for resentment, for the satisfaction of a man finally proven right, and found neither. "Do you want him fired?" she asked quietly, nodding toward Grant, expecting the answer to be an easy yes. "No," Darius said, and the single word surprised her more than anything else that morning. "Why?" she asked, genuinely unable to understand a restraint she wasn't sure she would have shown in his position. "Because I don't want revenge," Darius said. "I want the truth." The simplicity of the statement seemed to disarm even Grant for a moment, though he recovered quickly enough to attempt one final strike before the room turned entirely against him. "There's something you should all know about Darius," Grant said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old confidence. "He signed a document years ago that makes him personally liable if this company is ever formally investigated." The room went still again, all eyes shifting toward Darius, waiting for denial that never came. "That's true," Darius said, without hesitation, without the defensiveness of a man caught in something he wished to hide. "Why would you sign that?" Vivian asked, horrified on his behalf in a way she hadn't expected to feel for a man she had fired only hours earlier. "Because someone had to," Darius said simply, the same quiet conviction he had carried through every other revelation that morning. Malcolm turned toward Grant with an expression that had shed its last trace of patience. "You made one mistake," he said. "What?" Grant asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "You thought Darius was alone," Malcolm said, and at that exact moment the conference room door opened to reveal a team of independent auditors, files in hand, expressions entirely professional, and entirely unmoved by the tension crackling through the room. The auditors moved through the office with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before, in rooms far more hostile than this one, pulling files, cross-checking servers, asking questions that grew sharper. The longer Grant's answers grew vaguer. Grant demanded, at one point, that Vivian intervene and halt the process before it went any further, his voice carrying a desperation that had abandoned all pretense of professionalism. Vivian, for the first time in longer than she could remember, did not move to protect him. She stood instead beside Darius, watching the process unfold with a stillness that felt, to her, like the first honest decision she had made in years. Darius guided the auditors through the more complicated portions of the system without hesitation, pointing toward anomalies most people would have needed hours to locate. One of the auditors paused, glancing up at him with open curiosity. "How did you know exactly where to look?" she asked. "I built part of it," Darius said, and the simplicity of the answer landed with more weight than any boast could have managed. Vivian watched him move through the data with a fluency that startled her, realizing only now the scale of what he understood about a company she had spent 2 years believing she alone commanded. He wasn't simply an employee who had once helped fix a broken system. He was, in ways she was only beginning to grasp, one of the architects of the very foundation the company still stood on. Grant, sensing the ground shifting entirely out from under him, turned his frustration toward Darius directly, his voice sharp, with the particular cruelty of a man watching his power dissolve in real time. "You're doing this because you were humiliated," Grant said. "Because they threw you out, and now you want to burn the whole place down out of spite." Darius met his eyes without flinching. "No," he said. "Then why?" Grant demanded, his composure fully gone now. "Because if I wanted revenge," Darius said, "I would have let the company collapse 3 years ago, and let all of you sink with it. The words landed with a finality that silenced even Grant, who had no answer capable of matching that kind of restraint. Malcolm watched the exchange from across the room, his expression carrying a quiet pride that needed no words to communicate. And the look he shared with Darius told the rest of the room everything about the trust between them that no explanation ever could. By the end of the day, the auditors had confirmed what the documents already suggested: millions of dollars routed through a web of intermediary companies designed specifically to obscure their final destination. Grant's signature appeared on a significant portion of the approvals, a fact he could no longer dispute given the paper trail laid bare in front of him. But as the final report was compiled, one more document surfaced that changed the tone of the room entirely: a signature at the bottom of a critical transfer authorization that did not belong to Grant at all. It belonged to Vivian. She stared at the page for a long moment, certain there had been some mistake, certain she would never have approved a transaction she had no memory of ever seeing. Grant, seizing the opening with the last of his remaining nerve, pointed toward the signature with something close to triumph. "You signed it," he said, as though the discovery might drag her down with him and dilute his own guilt in the process. Darius leaned over the document, studying the signature with the same careful patience he had applied to everything else that day, comparing it against samples pulled from earlier records without a word of explanation to anyone watching. After several long seconds, he looked up. "This signature is real," he said, and Vivian felt the floor tilt beneath her once again. "Then what happened?" she asked, her voice smaller now than it had been all morning. "Someone used your authority," Darius said, "without your knowledge." The realization settled over Vivian slowly, the understanding that she had not simply failed to notice Grant's manipulation from a distance, but had, in some way she still didn't fully understand, been used as an instrument within it. She spent the following hours combing through her own access logs, her own approvals, tracing the moments where her authority had been quietly borrowed without her consent. It became clear that Grant had exploited not just the systems around her, but the very trust she had extended to him as her closest advisor, someone she had never thought to question, because questioning him had always felt unnecessary. And yet, she understood, some portion of the blame remained hers to carry, not because she had acted with malice, but because she had allowed her trust to substitute for the scrutiny her position required. She sought Darius out later that afternoon, finding him in the quiet corner, near the window where his desk had once stood, now empty, except for the outline of years spent working there unnoticed. "I treated you like you were invisible," she said, the words arriving without the polish of rehearsal, raw in a way her earlier apologies to the board had never been. Darius didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to hold the weight her confession deserved before responding. "Why didn't you fight back?" she finally asked, unable to understand the patience he had shown through years of being overlooked. "Because I knew," he said, "that one day the truth would have to speak for itself, whether anyone gave it permission to or not." Vivian looked toward the empty space where his desk had been, remembering the sound of her own voice, telling him to pack it, and felt the words settle into her chest as the defining mistake of her career. It was no longer simply a sentence she had spoken in anger or convenience. It had become, in the span of a single day, the moment she would measure every future decision against. Malcolm approached them both later that evening, his tone shifting from investigator to something closer to an old friend extending an offer. "Darius," he said, "I want you to run operations." Darius shook his head, the refusal immediate and unforced. Vivian, surprised, asked him why he would turn down a position that so clearly belonged to him after everything the day had revealed. "Because I'm not interested in taking someone's position," Darius said. "Then what do you want?" Malcolm asked, genuinely curious now. "A company," Darius said slowly, "where people don't have to become powerful before they're treated with respect." Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then allowed a small, knowing smile to cross his face. "Then you're going to love what happens tomorrow," he said, offering no further explanation before turning to leave the room, letting the promise hang unresolved in the air behind him. The following morning, every employee at Whitmore Industries received a notice, calling for a company-wide gathering, the kind of announcement that had, in the past, usually preceded layoffs or restructuring rather than anything worth celebrating. The atrium filled slowly with uncertain faces, people who had learned through experience to treat sudden meetings with suspicion rather than hope. Malcolm stood at the front of the room, calm and unhurried, and began by confirming what many had already heard through hallway whispers, that ownership of the company had changed hands overnight. He announced that Grant Holloway had been suspended pending the outcome of a formal investigation, a statement met with a silence that seemed to carry more relief than shock. Vivian remained in her position as chief executive, though under a new structure that placed her decisions under closer oversight from the board Malcolm had assembled, a change he accepted without argument or resistance. And then, without fanfare, the doors at the back of the room opened, and Darius walked in. He no longer carried the worn leather bag that had accompanied him out of the building the day before, though his clothing remained as simple and unassuming as it always had, a deliberate refusal to perform importance for an audience that had once ignored him entirely. A young employee near the front, someone who had clearly heard rumors, but not the full story, asked the question hanging over the entire room. "Are you coming back?" she asked, her voice tentative, unsure whether the answer might disappoint her. "I never really left," Darius said. And the simplicity of the response drew a quiet ripple of understanding through the crowd. Malcolm stepped forward and delivered the announcement that would reshape the company's direction for years to come, his voice carrying easily through the silent atrium. "Effective today," he said, "Darius Bell will lead the company-wide operational transformation." The room absorbed the words in stunned stillness, the kind of silence that follows an announcement too significant to greet with immediate applause. Vivian rose from her seat before anyone else had a chance to react, walking to the front of the room with a steadiness that surprised even her. She turned to face the assembled employees, many of whom had watched Darius get fired only a day earlier without understanding what they were witnessing, and offered an apology she had never planned to give in public. "I was wrong," she said, the words carrying none of the practiced polish executives usually reserved for moments like this. It was, in many ways, the first time she had ever admitted fault to a room full of people who had no power to punish her for the confession. Darius listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he offered a response that reframed the entire apology in a way she hadn't expected. "Then, don't apologize to me," he said. Vivian looked at him, confused. "Who should I apologize to?" she asked. "Everyone you couldn't see," Darius said, "because you were too busy looking at titles." The room absorbed the statement in silence before the applause finally began. Not the polite kind reserved for executive announcements, but something warmer, more personal, the sound of people recognizing themselves in the sentiment being spoken aloud. It wasn't simply that Darius had been promoted. It was that, after years of being overlooked, he had finally been seen, and that recognition seemed to matter to the room more than any title ever could. As the applause settled, Malcolm raised a hand and asked for one final moment of attention before the meeting concluded. "There's one more announcement," he said, and a large screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a founding document that predated Whitmore Industries by nearly a decade. Darius's name appeared clearly across the top of the page, listed not as an employee, but as a founder of the very technology the company's entire operational system had eventually been built upon. Vivian stared at the screen, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and the slow dawning of a truth too large to process quickly. "Founder," she said quietly, almost to herself, the word reshaping everything she thought she understood about the quiet man who had sat across from her in that conference room the day before. Malcolm allowed the revelation to settle, before offering the explanation the room clearly needed. Years earlier, long before Whitmore Industries existed in its current form, Darius had co-founded a small technology venture focused on operational systems, an idea born less from ambition and more from a genuine belief that businesses could function more honestly if they simply understood their own data. The technology never became famous. It never carried Darius's name into headlines or magazine profiles. Instead, it was quietly sold, absorbed into larger systems, its origins buried beneath layers of corporate acquisition, until it eventually became the very foundation upon which companies like Whitmore Industries built their operations. Why did you hide all of this? Vivian asked, unable to fully mask the disbelief in her voice. Because I wanted to know, Darius said, who people were when they thought I had nothing. The sentence landed with a weight that seemed to settle over the entire room, a quiet indictment not just of Vivian, but of every system built to reward visibility over substance. Vivian absorbed the words slowly, understanding now that his 3 years of silence had never been passive. It had been, in its own way, a test, one she had failed, until circumstances forced her to see him clearly. She turned toward Malcolm, one final question rising to the surface, the one detail from the previous day she still hadn't fully understood. And the hug? She asked. Malcolm smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he had shown since arriving. That wasn't a business decision, he said, glancing toward Darius with an affection that needed no further explanation. That was for my brother. They were not brothers by blood, but by something the years had made just as binding, a friendship forged during a period neither man spoke about often. Malcolm had once faced a collapse of his own, a business failure so complete it had nearly ended his career before it properly began. And in the wreckage of that failure, most of the people around him had simply disappeared. Darius had been the one person who stayed, offering neither pity nor easy solutions, simply presence, the quiet reassurance that someone still believed rebuilding was possible. That loyalty had never required a title to matter, and it had followed both men through the years that eventually brought them back into this exact building, this exact room, this exact reckoning. Vivian understood now, standing in the atrium surrounded by employees still processing the morning's revelations, that the man she had dismissed as unremarkable had, in fact, quietly helped hold the entire company together, not once, but twice. The final confrontation with Grant arrived not in person, but through a legal call patched into the conference room a week later, his voice tinny and distant over the speaker, still attempting to salvage some version of control over a situation that had long since slipped beyond his reach. He threatened, with the particular desperation of a man watching consequences finally catch up to him, to drag both Vivian and Darius down alongside him if the investigation continued. Darius listened to the threats without visible reaction, his calm unbroken by accusations that carried no real weight behind them. Let him talk, he said quietly to Malcolm once the call ended, an instruction that seemed, on its surface, almost too generous given everything Grant had done. Why? Malcolm asked, genuinely curious about the restraint. Because every lie, Darius said, creates another piece of evidence. The investigation continued in the weeks that followed, each new claim from Grant collapsing further under the weight of documentation that had, ironically, been preserved because of the very systems Darius had built years earlier. Months passed, and Whitmore Industries slowly reshaped itself under a structure that finally matched the values it had long claimed to hold. Darius took on his new role not as a symbol of triumph, but as he had approached everything before it, quietly, methodically, more interested in fixing broken systems than in being praised for fixing them. Vivian changed too, though the change came slowly, built through small decisions rather than dramatic gestures, a willingness to look past titles when evaluating who deserved to be heard in a room. She stopped assuming competence based on confidence alone, learning instead to notice the people who worked without asking for recognition, the ones history so often forgot to credit. It wasn't a perfect transformation, and she never pretended it was, but it was honest, and for the first time in her career, that honesty mattered more to her than the appearance of control. One afternoon, months after the day everything had changed, Vivian walked into Darius's new office, carrying a small wooden crate she set carefully on the corner of his desk. Darius looked up from his work, curiosity flickering across his face as he studied the box without immediately opening it. "What is that?" he asked. "Your old desk," Vivian said, and Darius felt something unexpected rise in his chest, somewhere between amusement and disbelief, as he lifted the lid to find the chipped mug and worn notebook he had once carried out of the building without complaint. "I kept it," Vivian said before he could ask why. Darius looked up at her, waiting, sensing there was more she wanted to say. "So I wouldn't forget," she continued, her voice quieter now, stripped of the authority she once wore so easily. The day I told you to pack your desk was the day I almost destroyed the best thing this company had. Darius set the mug down gently and rose from his chair, meeting her gaze without the resentment she had clearly braced herself to face. I think we're okay now, he said, the words carrying no bitterness, only the quiet finality of a man who had never needed an apology to move forward. Are we? Vivian asked, still searching his face for reassurance she wasn't entirely sure she deserved. We can be, Darius said, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to settle something in her that had remained unresolved since the morning she'd first told him to leave. A knock sounded at the door, and Malcolm leaned into the frame, his expression carrying the same calm confidence it had held since the day he first stepped off that elevator. Ready? He asked, glancing between the two of them. Always, Darius said, and the three of them left the office together, their footsteps fading down a hallway that had once carried the sound of a man walking out with nothing more than a worn leather bag. The old desk remained behind, sitting quietly in the corner of the office, no longer a symbol of dismissal, but a reminder of everything that had nearly been lost through carelessness, disguised as authority. Darius had walked into that building years earlier as a man nobody noticed, content to work in silence, expecting no reward beyond the quiet satisfaction of a job done honestly. He walked out of that same building, months after the day he was fired, as a man no one could bring themselves to overlook again, his value no longer hidden behind modesty or convenience. And the phrase that had once been wielded against him as a weapon, delivered without a second thought in a cold conference room, had transformed into something else entirely, a marker not of an ending, but of the exact moment everything finally began to change. He had never needed the chair at the head of the table to prove what he was capable of. He had only needed someone, eventually, willing to look.